What no one knew. The hidden story that changed Cristiano Ronaldo forever. What started as a simple football match in Rio de Janeiro turned into one of the most shocking stories ever told about Cristiano Ronaldo. A little girl, a letter, and a promise the star would never forget. But when fate put his word to the test, Ronaldo made a decision that defied the impossible and left the world breathless. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. Ronaldo walked down the hallway of the Misericordia Hospital in Rio de Janeiro as people recognized him. He signed a few autographs along the way, smiled, but his mind was elsewhere. Then he saw her. Sarah was at the end of the hallway. Sarah watched him from a corner, next to her mother and father. Her eyes were as deep as the ocean, but there was a fragility in her body, as if she were struggling to stay seated on her bed. She was 16 years old, but time seemed to have left her behind, trapped in a battle she didn't want to lose, even though her strength seemed to be failing. The connection he felt with Sarah was inexplicable. He had decided to cancel his entire schedule to come see her, and now that he was in front of her, everything took on a much deeper meaning. "Hello, Sarah," he said in a soft but firm voice. The girl lifted her head, smiling shyly, as if she couldn't believe that the great Ronaldo was there, standing before her. Her mother, beside her, looked at her with eyes full of pride and hope, despite the circumstances. Her father, quieter, observed with a glimmer of emotion in his eyes. The atmosphere was filled with an inexplicable warmth, a moment of peace that only the smallest details can create. "How are you?" Ronaldo asked, crouching down to be at the girl's eye level. The pain in her eyes was palpable, but there was also a fight, a spark of hope that refused to go out. "I'm okay, as much as I can be," Sarah replied with a weak smile, her voice barely a whisper. The words left an emptiness in the air, as if they couldn't express everything inside her. Ronaldo felt that sadness, that sensation of time slipping through his fingers, but at the same time, he sensed in her a strength that didn't want to stop fighting. "You know, I'm not going to leave you alone in this," Ronaldo said, with a firmness that was surprisingly not just in the strength of his words, but in the emotion he truly felt in his chest. "I promise." Sarah looked at him with eyes that seemed to have known too many goodbyes, but hope, that small yet relentless spark, lit up again. "I don't know if I deserve it, but thank you for being here," she whispered. Sarah's words hit him like a punch to the chest. How could she think that? He leaned in a little more, as if his closeness could give her strength. "Of course you deserve it, Sarah," he said without hesitation. Time seemed to stop for a few seconds. No one said anything, but everyone felt the magnitude of that moment. Ronaldo knew that leukemia did not forgive. Sarah was on an endless waiting list. But he couldn't ignore her. "Not this time. I promise you I'll do everything in my power," he said, with a firmness that even surprised himself. And at that moment, like a magic trick that only a man like Ronaldo could create, the hope of Sarah and her family seemed just a little bit closer. Ronaldo couldn't stay still. The image of Sarah, weak and waiting for a miracle, lingered in his mind while his heart pounded at an uncontrollable speed. He had arrived at the hospital hoping to bring some comfort, but now he knew that wasn't enough. He needed to do something bigger, something that would keep that small spark of hope from fading. He stepped out into the hallway, gripping his phone with trembling hands. His football team, his friends, his network of contacts, everyone would be mobilized for this mission. He began sending messages, making calls, activating every resource at his disposal. Immediately, he wrote to Mohammed Salah, his good Egyptian friend, A man who knew what it was like to face challenges. I have a girl named Sarah here in Brazil. She's fighting leukemia and needs a bone marrow transplant. Do you know anyone who could be a donor or any foundation that might help? As he waited for a response, he continued calling hospitals and cancer foundations in Rio de Janeiro. But the answer was always the same. We're sorry, Mr. Ronaldo, but there are no compatible donors available at this time. Desperation crept into his mind, but he was not a man who gave up easily. He sent message after message, but there was no reply. He checked Sulla's last online status. It had been hours ago. Was he available? Would he realize the urgency? He spoke with the hospital director, with oncology specialists, asking if there was any other option, any alternative they hadn't considered. But nothing seemed to work. With each passing minute, the urgency intensified. Ronaldo felt anxiety consuming him, but he forced himself to stay focused. The girl was counting on him. Then his phone vibrated. It was a message from Sulla. There's a possible donor in Cairo, Egypt. They're verifying. Relief was immediate, though brief. He couldn't celebrate yet. The most important part was still missing: compatibility. Not even 5 minutes later, Sulla wrote again. The hospital has already contacted the donor. We'll have the final answer soon. Ronaldo let out a sigh of relief, but the battle was far from over. He decided to stay at the hospital with Sarah and her family, no matter what happened. He wasn't going to leave until he knew everything was settled. It wasn't just about helping a girl. It was his promise, his commitment to her family, to all those who needed a tangible hope. Then his phone rang again. It was a call from the hospital in Cairo. Ronaldo answered anxiously. Is the match confirmed? The voice on the other end responded, yes. The compatibility is excellent. We can proceed. Sarah's mother's lips trembled, and her father let out a muffled sob. But it was the kind of cry that fills the heart with hope, not sadness. The miracle everyone had been waiting for, though distant, was beginning to take shape. Sarah, we did it, Ronaldo exclaimed, gently taking her hand. You have a donor. The fight doesn't end here, but today we won an important battle. You're going to be okay. I promise you. But then his phone rang again. This time, the voice on the line sounded worried. Mr. Ronaldo, there's a problem with the donor's transport. Ronaldo couldn't stop the shiver that ran through his body when the phone rang again. He knew what he was about to hear, but that didn't make the weight of the words any easier to bear. He looked at the screen and saw Sulla's name on the incoming call. He answered instantly, his breathing unsteady, aware that there was no time to waste. Ronaldo, listen, there's something very urgent you need to know, said Sulla's voice, grave and pressing. The window of opportunity for Sarah's transplant is incredibly short. If we don't get her here in the next few hours, the donor might no longer be available. We can't afford to lose this chance. The only viable option is to transfer Sarah to Cairo, and we need to do it fast. A knot formed in Ronaldo's stomach. Can't we bring the bone marrow here? Ronaldo asked, clinging to a simpler alternative. Sulla sighed on the other end, as if he was sharing a burden he wished he didn't have to. Transporting it is unfeasible. The only option is to bring Sarah. Make sure everything is ready. We're waiting for her arrival. But Ronaldo, you have to be quick. Ronaldo fell silent for a moment, feeling the weight of every word. He knew there was no time to lose. Don't worry, I'll make it happen. I'll be with her as soon as possible. He hung up and ran through the hospital corridors. They needed a flight, a transcontinental air ambulance, without stops. Impossible. There was only one option left. The clock seemed to be working against him. But then, like a spark of clarity, a simple yet bold solution crossed his mind. My private jet, his private jet, a Gulfstream G650, was the only option. It would fly nonstop to Cairo, avoiding the delays of a commercial flight. Without thinking further, Ronaldo called his personal pilot. I need the jet ready in an hour, equipped for an urgent medical transfer. I'll have it ready in an hour, Ronaldo. Don't worry, we'll make it happen. The pilot replied with a calmness that contrasted with the speed of Ronaldo's thoughts. But there was no time to relax. Ronaldo spent the next few minutes coordinating every detail, ensuring that the doctors were ready to receive Sarah and that the transfer would be as comfortable and safe as possible. Every passing second felt like an eternity. He ran back to the hospital where Sarah's family was waiting, a mixture of disbelief and hope on their faces. We have a plan, he said, with determination running through his bones. We're transferring her to Cairo on a private flight. We'll make sure we don't miss this opportunity. Sarah's mother could hardly believe it. A private flight? This fast? Ronaldo nodded. We won't waste a single minute. We have to leave now. Every second counts. We're going to get that bone marrow and make this happen. Sarah, who had been silent, looked at Ronaldo with a mixture of awe and gratitude. She knew that at that moment he was more than just a football player. He was someone who wouldn't give up on anything, someone who had made the impossible possible. Thank you, Sarah whispered, though the words didn't seem enough to express what she felt. Time is our enemy, but we won't let it win, Ronaldo replied, a determined glint in his eyes. Now is when we need each other the most, and I won't fail you. The Gulfstream G650 was already waiting on the runway. Without wasting another second, they boarded. The pilot was on board, and everyone hurried onto the plane. Inside, the space was ready. An improvised bed for Sarah, oxygen, medication. Everything they would need for those crucial hours of flight. Ronaldo didn't want to lose another minute. The engine roared as the plane began to take off, cutting through the air, leaving Brazil behind, and heading toward Cairo. It carried more than just a sick child. It carried renewed hope, the conviction that, in Ronaldo's world, nothing was impossible. From the cockpit, the pilot reported moderate turbulence, but inside the aircraft, the real storm was unfolding next to Ronaldo. Sarah lay on a stretcher, secured with safety belts. Her eyelids were half closed, and her breathing was heavy, irregular. Beside her, two paramedics monitored her vital signs. One of them, a man whose face was weathered with experience, checked her blood pressure, while his younger colleague frowned at the screen of the portable monitor. Ronaldo, sitting next to Sarah, couldn't take his eyes off her. Each breath seemed weaker than the last. His trembling hand brushed against hers, as if that simple touch could anchor her to the world of the living. Her oxygen saturation is dropping, the paramedic announced urgently. 85%. 82%. Why is this happening? Ronaldo sat up, feeling a tight knot of panic in his chest. Get ready. She may go into shock, ordered Dr. Ramirez, a specialist in critical care, his voice firm. It could be a respiratory complication or a drop in blood pressure, the paramedic replied while pulling out an adrenaline ampoule. If it keeps going down, we could lose her before we land. No! Ronaldo felt his blood turn cold with fear. Do something. The plane shook with another bout of turbulence. A sharp beeping sound came from the heart monitor. Sarah's heartbeat was slowing down. Prepare 100% oxygen, the doctor ordered. We need to stabilize her now. With expert hands, they placed the oxygen mask over Sarah's face. but her breathing remained weak. Ronaldo felt an irrational urge to shout at her, to beg her not to give up. "We need adrenaline," said the doctor, loading a syringe. "If we don't stabilize her in the next few minutes, she could go into shock." "Do it," Ronaldo ordered without hesitation. Dr. Ramirez injected the dose with precision, and everyone held their breath. The seconds stretched unbearably. Ronaldo watched as Sarah's chest seemed still, as if each breath cost her double the effort. And then a stronger beep from the monitor. "She's responding," the paramedic whispered, a slight relief in her voice. "Her blood pressure is rising slowly." The plane swayed again, but Ronaldo didn't care. He only saw that small sign of life on the monitor and the faint color returning to Sarah's cheeks. He sank back into his seat, his heart still pounding in his throat. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, he took Sarah's hand in his. "Hold on a little longer," he whispered, leaning toward her. "We're almost there." Sarah didn't respond, but her hand, though weak, seemed to squeeze Ronaldo's with the slightest effort. And that was enough. The doctor frowned. Every second counted. Would they make it in time? On board the plane, the tension was palpable. Sarah was asleep, exhausted from the medication. Her parents murmured in low voices, unable to believe what was happening. Ronaldo looked out the window, aware that every second counted. The flight attendant appeared in the cabin, the adrenaline still reflected in her eyes. Ronaldo looked up, intrigued. Sarah's parents, who for a moment seemed to have forgotten everything that had happened outside the plane, now turned their attention to the attendant. She moved slowly to the center of the cabin, looking at everyone before beginning her account. Getting the ambulance into the hangar was chaos. It wasn't authorized, but we managed to bypass the protocols before anyone could stop it. Leonor looked at the attendant with an expression of astonishment. "The ambulance? Wasn't there another way?" The attendant took a deep breath before responding. "No. These kinds of flights don't allow ambulances without explicit authorization. They didn't permit it, but time was crucial. So I had to talk to several officials to get them to accept the ambulance inside the hangar. And once we did, we had to improvise. The technicians worked like crazy to prepare the plane in record time. They made space for the stretcher, installed medical equipment, oxygen." Ronaldo remained silent, absorbing what he was hearing. The complicity of everyone, the urgency that had marked each step. Sarah's life had depended on a group of people stepping out of their comfort zones, risking more than just their jobs. That was what people didn't see at first glance. The effort, the sweat, the endless nights. And everything they had done for her. "And the takeoff?" asked Sarah's father. "We skipped the queue and were given priority after battle with air traffic control." A smile hovered on Ronaldo's lips, a mix of gratitude and amazement. It wasn't just a team of pilots, technicians, and flight attendants. It was a group of people willing to move mountains so that a life could be saved. The atmosphere inside the plane tensed slightly, as if the gravity of what was at stake had finally surfaced. No one spoke for a moment, all of them processing the magnitude of the sacrifice and the logistics orchestrated behind the scenes. Finally, Ronaldo broke the silence. "You made it possible," he said with a calmness that reflected the weight of the responsibility he carried. "Thank you. Thank you all. What you are doing for Sarah is bigger than anything I've ever seen." The attendant nodded, almost moved, with a sincere smile on her face. "We're just doing what we have to do. And if everything goes well, we will have achieved the impossible." Ronaldo looked out the window. In that moment, he knew he wasn't alone. The entire plane, The entire team, everyone who had made this flight possible, shared a single hope: reaching Cairo in time to save Sarah. But the clock kept ticking, and the margin for error was zero. Would they make it before it was too late? The plane moved steadily through the clouds. From his seat, Ronaldo gazed at the horizon, but his mind was elsewhere. The memories came rushing in. For years earlier in Rio de Janeiro, the city pulsed with life. Ronaldo was just beginning his career. It was a modest match, but for him, every pass brought him closer to his dream. At the end of the game, Ronaldo was heading to the locker rooms when a 12-year-old girl, her face lit by a mix of determination and shyness, approached him, holding out a folded piece of paper. Ronaldo looked at her and, without thinking, took it. The girl said nothing, only offered him a small smile and took a step back, watching him silently. Ronaldo held the paper in his hands for a moment. He could feel the weight of the girl's gaze on him. What could be written on that paper that she seemed to treasure so much? Finally, with a sigh, he unfolded the letter and began to read. What he read surprised him. Sarah, with simple handwriting, told him how much she admired him and how his effort inspired her. At the end, she had composed a song for him. The message of the song summed it up. Every goal you score is a victory for all of us who dream. Ronaldo was silent. She was just a girl, but her words moved him. He couldn't hear the melody, but he felt it within him. On his hardest days, Ronaldo would take out the letter, touch it, and feel the melody inside him. On the plane, Ronaldo took out the letter, worn, but with words intact. He still felt the connection with Sarah. Every goal you score is a victory for all of us who dream, he whispered to himself. The words took on a new resonance, a new urgency. It wasn't just his dream that had been fueled by that letter. It was Sarah's dream, the dream of her family, of everyone who had believed in him. In that instant, Ronaldo felt something more than the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. He felt a connection, a deep connection with that girl who had crossed his path on an ordinary afternoon when he was just a rising player, and she was just a girl with a song. Now, that girl was fighting for her life, and Ronaldo, with everything he had, was going to do whatever it took to save her. Not just for her, not just for her parents, but for all the dreams that had intertwined, for all the times that a letter, a song, could change the course of a life. As the plane moved forward, Ronaldo clenched the letter tightly. He couldn't fail her. Not now. Not when she had saved him first, years ago, without even knowing it. Hold on, Sarah, he whispered, feeling a weight in his chest that wouldn't let him breathe fully. He carefully put the letter away. He closed his eyes. In his mind, Sarah's melody was still alive. The soft hum of the engines was the only thing breaking the silence in the airplane cabin. Ronaldo gazed out the window, where the sky stretched in an infinite blue, but his mind was elsewhere. Instead, it was in a place much closer, warmer, though marked by the traces of time, a memory from 4 years ago, when everything had begun. Ronaldo closed his eyes for a moment. In his mind, Sarah's voice echoed again, just like that day in the stadium. The little girl with curly hair, holding her letter for him. He never imagined that years later, he would be the one fighting for her life. Since that day in the stadium, Ronaldo had stayed in contact with Sarah's family. Occasional messages, calls on special dates, and a silent support that had never ceased to be present. He had watched the girl grow from a distance, celebrating her small victories and suffering her defeats. Now more than ever, he felt that his destiny was intertwined with hers. Now, on this flight rushing him toward the urgency of saving Sarah, Ronaldo looked at the girl's parents, sitting beside him, almost in silence. This was not the moment for empty words, nor for the gestures he was used to making in front of the cameras. "Thank you," he whispered softly, almost to himself. Sarah's parents, aware of everything Ronaldo had done for them, turned to look at him, surprised by the sincerity reflected on his face. "What if we don't make it in time?" murmured Sarah's mother, her voice barely audible in the cabin. Her hands trembled as she clutched the seat. Ronaldo looked at her intently and, with a calmness he barely felt, responded, "We're going to make it. And Sarah is going to win this match. Just like always." He said it even though deep inside, he was asking himself the same questions. Uncertainty, something that rarely affected him on the field, was now hitting him harder than any opponent ever had. "You know, Ronaldo," Mrs. Lucretia said, "when Sarah was younger, she used to watch you play and said she wanted to be like you. It didn't matter how many times she fell or if other kids told her she couldn't do it. She always got back up. She would say, 'Ronaldo doesn't give up. I won't either.'" Did she really say that? Ronaldo responded, moved. "Yes," Lucretia answered, nodding with teary eyes. Even when she started getting sick and things got tough, she held on to that mindset. "I remember a day at the hospital. She was tired, weak. But even then, she looked at me and said, 'Mom, if Ronaldo can turn a match around in the last minute, I can win this one too.' I never knew I meant so much to her," Ronaldo said, touching his chest, overcome with emotion. "But I promise you something. I won't let her lose this match. Not while I can do something about it." A sudden beep in the cabin broke the silence. Ronaldo looked up. The pilot spoke in a tense tone. "We've got unexpected crosswinds on our route. There might be a delay." Ronaldo felt a knot in his stomach. He couldn't afford to lose a single minute. A faint whimper broke the silence in the cabin. Sarah's mother, who had remained in a silent vigil until then, leaned over her daughter, her heart clenched in anguish. Under the dim airplane light, the girl's skin looked even paler, and her barely perceptible breathing had become shallower. Dr. Ramirez quickly approached, his frown betraying his concern as he checked the monitor. Ronaldo, who had been lost in his thoughts, felt a jolt of alarm upon seeing the doctor's expression. He moved closer at once, his breath unsteady. The doctor adjusted the foreflow with steady, precise hands. "Her body is weakened, and every minute counts." The words fell like a heavy weight on Ronaldo's shoulders. He clenched his fists and looked toward the cockpit, where the pilot remained focused on the route. Without wasting a second, he walked decisively to the communicator and gripped it firmly. "How much longer until we arrive?" he asked, containing the urgency pounding in his chest. The pilot's voice responded calmly, though with a subtle note of understanding in his tone. They would do their best to make up time without compromising flight safety. Ronaldo leaned back in his seat, gazing out the window as the airplane cut through the clouds, which stretched out white and soft like a distant ocean. The stillness of the flight gave him space to think, but also allowed him to look back at everything he had accomplished to get here. Beside him, Leonore was reading documents on her tablet, but when she felt his gaze, she looked up. "Everything okay?" she asked gently. Ronaldo smiled, though his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "Everything's fine, just thinking about what's ahead. When I arrive in Cairo, I want to bring more than just promises of help. A symbolic gesture that makes a difference. The only thing that matters now is that Sarah gets her transplant in time. But I also want to take advantage of our stay in Cairo to create a real impact, a gesture, a concrete help for those in need. You know my style. Take care of it. Then let's get to work. Leonor said, standing up to make a call, certain that Ronaldo wasn't going to let anything get in the way. Despite his determination, Ronaldo couldn't help but wonder if he would make it in time. What if something went wrong with the operation? What if bureaucratic delays pushed things back even further? The flight attendant rushed in, her face tense. Ronaldo knew immediately that something was wrong. The headwind has been stronger than expected, and our fuel is running low, she said, her tone slightly graver than usual. This is the first time we've taken this route, and the situation is a bit more complicated than anticipated. Ronaldo raised an eyebrow, his natural problem-solving instinct kicking in immediately. He wasn't a man who let panic take over. What can we do to fix it? He asked calmly, knowing time was critical, but refusing to show any sign of worry. The attendant hesitated, taking a deep breath before continuing. If we don't get authorization to ascend, we'll have to make an unplanned stop to refuel. Ronaldo frowned, finishing the thought with intrigue. So, if we get that authorization, we can ascend high enough for the plane to save fuel and reach our destination without issues? The attendant nodded, visibly relieved that Ronaldo grasped the severity of the situation. Exactly. If we're allowed to reach maximum cruising altitude, we'll gain the efficiency we need. But, as I said, this isn't something we can do without clearance from air traffic control. Ronaldo remained silent for a moment, his thoughts sharp and precise. There was something about this situation that felt more like a challenge than a mere obstacle. A challenge? Yes. And he loved solving challenges. But he knew the only way to succeed was to ensure this wasn't a definitive no. Do this, he finally said, standing up with determination. Put me in contact with the captain. I want to speak with him directly. The attendant looked at him, surprised. Right now, sir? Yes, right now, Ronaldo replied, with that tense calm that precedes action. They fly the plane, but I make the impossible happen. We're going to do this. The attendant took her radio and attempted to contact the pilot, but only static responded. They're communicating with air traffic control, she murmured in frustration. They might not be able to answer you. Tell them it's a matter of life and death, Ronaldo insisted. As the attendant stepped into the cockpit, Ronaldo sat back down, his thoughts rapidly taking shape in his mind. The risk of not arriving on time was obvious, and the responsibility he felt for Sarah, for her family, for everyone involved, drove him to take the next step, as he had done so many times before in his life. He couldn't fail. He mustn't. Not now. The next step was securing that authorization, and he would get it, no matter what obstacles stood in his way. The airplane aisle seemed longer than usual as Ronaldo made his way toward the cockpit. The tension in the air was palpable, as if the weight of the situation were overflowing into every corner of the plane. With the attendant's permission, Ronaldo gently pushed open the cockpit door, his gaze fixed on his friend, the captain. Tell me, how critical is our fuel situation? He asked, his voice firm but with a spark of concern he could not hide. The captain, who had been attentively watching the panel screens, looked up at him, his face serious and determined. Here's the situation, Cristiano. If in less than 10 minutes we do not receive authorization to ascend to the maximum flight ceiling, we will have no chance of reaching Cairo. And in that case, I will have to divert to another airport to refuel. I don't like to say it, but that is the reality. Ronaldo nodded gravely, but ideas began to arise in his mind. And what about someone in the Cairo control tower? Maybe they could put pressure to make it happen. The captain looked at his co-pilot, who was focused on his own set of controls, and then turned his attention back to Ronaldo. We could try, but the chances are limited. If time continues to run out, that option will also be off the table. Ronaldo leaned against the door frame, his forehead sweating despite the airplane's air conditioning, and his eyes fixed on the distance as he thought. In his life, he had always believed that the secret lay in connections, in the people you know, in the favors you can ask for when the stakes are high. "Let's do it," said Ronaldo firmly. "I will stay here until we achieve it." Minutes that seemed like hours passed as nervousness seized the cabin. Every second counted, and he knew that in situations like this, he could not afford to give up. "There are 5 minutes left," said the captain, with evident pressure in his voice. The clock seemed to move slowly, each second stealing hope from him. Ronaldo knew that Sarah's future depended on those 3 minutes. "This is it," he thought. "There is no turning back." Finally, the voice of the Cairo control tower broke the silence. "I'm sorry, but we cannot approve your request at this time. There is too much air traffic." Ronaldo's stomach sank. It couldn't be. They had calculated every detail, every variable. Would it all end here? The captain tried again. "Cairo Tower, this is a medical emergency. I request an immediate reconsideration. I repeat, we need to ascend to 50,000 feet to save a life." The radio channel fell silent. Second after second, the weight became unbearable. "There are less than 4 minutes left," murmured the co-pilot. Suddenly, the loudspeaker came back to life. "Understood. We will review the situation." Another pause. Too long. Ronaldo clenched his fists. They couldn't fail now. Suddenly, just when the tension reached its peak, the communication was cut off. "No, no, no," exclaimed the captain, quickly readjusting the frequencies. "Cairo Tower, do you copy?" Silence. Ronaldo felt his pulse in his temples. This couldn't be happening. 1 second. 2. 3. A static crackle flooded the cabin, and then the voice of the control tower finally returned. "You will need a high rate of climb to traverse the upper traffic. Plan the maneuver and notify us when you are ready, indicating the rate of climb you will use. We will tell you precisely when to initiate the ascent maneuver." Ronaldo closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. Finally, the weight he had carried on his shoulders lightened, although he knew there was still much to do. The captain turned his head toward Ronaldo, his brow furrowed in concentration. "We're going to be shaken hard. Go back with the flight attendant and make sure everyone has their seat belts fastened properly. Take all necessary measures with Sarah. We cannot allow any mistakes in this maneuver. As soon as you are ready, notify me immediately." The flight attendant quickly returned to the cabin, her face serious but determined. "Everything's ready, Captain," said the attendant. "Everyone in the rear is secured. We have also taken precautions with Sarah, as she took her seat and secured herself." The captain nodded, attentively watching the radar, and then addressed the microphone to notify the Cairo control tower. "Cairo control tower, we have planned a climb rate of 4,000 feet per minute. We are ready to execute the maneuver as soon as we receive your confirmation." A few seconds later, the calm voice of the control tower responded. "Received. Please stand by for our confirmation." A few seconds passed in which the tension increased, and the crew already had their hands on the controls, ready to initiate the maneuver. The control tower broke the silence. "Proceed with the planning. You are authorized to ascend to 50,000 feet. You have 20 seconds to initiate the maneuver at a rate of 4,000 feet per minute. Notify us when you begin." Immediately, the pilot responded, "Initiating climb maneuver right now," as they moved the controls, and the plane began to ascend rapidly. Back in the cabin, everyone felt the rapid movement and clung to their seats. The plane began to ascend abruptly, the vibration and jolts shaking the fuselage. Ronaldo, with his heart racing, suddenly felt out of place. He was not accustomed to this type of maneuver. Was that feeling normal? He asked himself, his mind racing with doubts. Were they all safe? The jolt seemed to intensify, and he could not help but wonder if something was out of control. He saw the terror reflected in the faces of everyone around him. Were they aware of the risk? At that moment, Ronaldo gathered his strength, despite his own fear, and with a trembling but firm voice said, "Calm down. The pilot said that this would be like this. It's controlled." Through the cold sweat that continued to form on his forehead, Ronaldo tried to calm himself, but uncertainty overwhelmed him. Would it be possible to complete the maneuver in the time they had to save the necessary fuel? And if they didn't succeed? The thought that everything could collapse in those seconds tormented him. The cabin filled with silence. Only the sound of the ascent, growing louder, accompanied his thoughts. In those moments, nothing seemed certain. Ronaldo looked out the airplane window, the lights of Cairo flickering in the distance, a sight that filled him with a mix of relief and anxiety. He was close, very close, but the weight of uncertainty still accompanied him. The promise of a future for Sarah, a hope that seemed as tangible as the air, but that could vanish at any moment. The roar of the engines, the vibration of the cabin, everything seemed to have been amplified as the plane entered the city of Cairo. It was then that the passenger cabin door opened gently, and the flight attendant entered with a serious but controlled expression. Ronaldo looked at her immediately, his gaze fixed on her eyes, as if he were trying to read the answer before she spoke. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice firmer than he felt at that moment. The flight had been a succession of ups and downs, both physical and emotional, and he knew that there was still one obstacle to overcome. "There is a delay, Cristiano," she said, glancing for a moment at the other passengers. "An incident on the ground has caused a delay, and several planes are piled up waiting. If we do not receive authorization soon, we could be in a complicated situation." Ronaldo felt a chill. A knot tightened in his stomach as he imagined that the seconds could be what makes the difference between success and disaster. Every extra minute in the air was one more heartbeat for Sarah. His mind could not stop thinking about one thing: the fuel. And the fuel, he insisted, worry taking over his tone. The calculations were still floating in his mind, the mathematics of survival. If the wait was prolonged beyond what he could endure, they would not have enough fuel to reach the ground safely. The flight attendant took a deep breath before responding. "Thanks to you, Cristiano. Thanks to the efficient fuel management during the flight, we have the capacity to wait. The fuel we saved by following that more efficient route, the one that allowed us to ascend to the maximum flight ceiling, is what gives us leeway in this situation. We are prepared to deal with this delay. Without that, we would not have made it." Ronaldo let out a sigh he did not know he had been holding. It was a relief, but not complete. He was not out of danger yet. Not until Sarah was out of harm's way. As the plane remained suspended in the air, Ronaldo could not help but think of Sarah, who was already awake in her bed. Her fight was her fight. Finally, after long minutes of waiting that threatened to extinguish Sarah's hopes, they received authorization to land, and an announcement of "Fasten your seat belts" resounded through the speakers. Ronaldo felt a relief, thinking that they had overcome all the obstacles. The descent proceeded normally, the city lights growing ever closer. Ronaldo exhaled a sigh of relief as he saw the proximity of the ground, indicating the imminent touchdown on the runway. and suddenly a quick jolt followed a rapid rise. Everyone clung to their seats with their hair on end, and Leonor, who was beside Ronaldo, couldn't help but dig her nails into his arm. "Everything is under control," said the captain firmly to his crew. "We are going to land with more room. We don't need that much to put the plane on the ground, but extending the maneuver never hurts." Ronaldo felt a momentary relief as he saw the plane beginning to stabilize. The rapid ascent was followed by a much more controlled descent. While the passengers relaxed, Ronaldo wondered what had really been happening in the air. The feeling of calm was deceptive. Ronaldo managed to hear the pilot communicating to the control tower. "Tower, we are extending the landing maneuver due to an incursion at the head of the runway." Finally, the plane touched down softly, the main wheel making contact with the runway in a perfect landing. The passengers let out a collective sigh of relief, although some, like Ronaldo, were still processing what had just happened. As the plane rolled toward the terminal, Ronaldo looked out the window, his nerves easing. He had been on the brink of getting lost in chaos, but he had survived it. Somehow, everything had fallen into place. The plane was safe, they were safe, and most importantly, Sarah still had a chance. Suddenly, he realized something. He had done all of this for her. Everything he had done, every sacrifice, every call, every maneuver was for her. Sarah was waiting, and now, finally, everything seemed to be aligning for her to reach the life she deserved. Suddenly, the pilot's voice came through the communication system, calm but firm. "We have received instructions from the tower. They are asking us to proceed to a special review area to conduct a report and analysis of the situation." The pilot, aware of the gravity of the situation, did not delay in taking a brief pause before responding, looking at the team behind the cockpit and then toward the runway. "With all due respect, Tower, we understand the request, but we cannot stop. Our passenger's condition is critical, and an ambulance is waiting for us in the hangar." The plane accelerated once again, heading nonstop toward the hangar, where an ambulance was waiting to receive Sarah. The wind seemed to blow strongly, as if the universe were pushing the plane toward its destination, hastening the remaining minutes. As the plane finally stopped in front of the hangar, the doors opened and the roar of the waiting ambulance filled the air. Ronaldo saw the paramedics hurrying to receive Sarah, preparing her with the urgency of one who knows the value of every moment. The engines shut down completely, and the echo of the doors closing behind them resonated in the air, as Ronaldo watched, at last, the beginning of a new chapter for Sarah. Ronaldo approached the pilots with a mixture of gratitude and determination in his eyes. "Thank you," he said firmly, looking at the captain and the co-pilot. "What you did today is priceless. I know what you risked, and I will not forget it." The Asylum Hospital, a colossus of white walls and cutting-edge technology, looked more like a sanctuary of hope at that very moment. Ronaldo arrived hastily at the parking lot, and the taxi stopped beside the main entrance. The ambulance that minutes earlier had gotten ahead of them when leaving the airport with Sarah was now already leaving the hospital. Sarah's father, with a somber yet hopeful expression, walked alongside Leonor and Ronaldo, quickening his pace as time slipped away from them. 5 minutes later, Ronaldo arrived at the waiting area and was greeted by his friend Mohamed Salah, a renowned entrepreneur in Egyptian football who had done everything possible to ensure that the operation was a success. "She is already entering surgery. The marrow is ready and waiting for her," his friend said in a tone of relief, although the nerves were still visible on his face. While the doctors began working on Sarah, A group of prominent figures from the hospital approached to meet the footballer and the girl who had become a symbol of struggle and hope. "It is an honor, Cristiano," said one of them, with a mixture of respect and admiration. Ronaldo, with his determined and humble character, took the opportunity to thank them. The doctors who would attend to Sarah came out to meet them, the air tense as they prepared for the most critical intervention of her life. "The marrow is ready and surgery is the next step," explained one of the doctors in a professional tone but laden with empathy. "The situation is complicated. It is one of the most delicate operations we perform, but we have protocols that we have followed to the letter. Despite the difficulties, the chances of success are high, given the condition of the donor." Ronaldo listened attentively, his mind already at work, thinking about what else he could do. In his head, it was not only the doctors, nor just the girl or her parents, but the opportunity to help a community that had given so much to Sarah's family. Ronaldo fell silent, watching the doctors as they headed toward the operating room. The atmosphere in the operating room of the International As-Salam Hospital was tense, charged with a subtle but palpable electricity, as if every second were a battle between life and death. Ronaldo, together with Sarah's parents, waited in a nearby waiting room, lost in agitated thoughts as the clock seemed to stand still. The operation had begun more than 3 hours ago, and every minute of uncertainty was a threat to their sanity. Suddenly, the door opened. A doctor, with his lab coat splattered with red, walked toward them with firm steps, but visibly tired. His face, though professional, showed a hint of concern. Ronaldo stood up, feeling the weight of the moment in his chest. He did not know what to expect, but his intuition told him that something was wrong. "How is my daughter?" asked Sarah's father, his voice torn by fear. The doctor took a deep breath before responding, the brightness in his eyes speaking more than words could express. "We have encountered complications. The bone marrow is being accepted, but the engraftment is not progressing as we had expected. There is a risk of rejection, and we have had to administer an emergency treatment to stabilize her." The blow was hard. Ronaldo, who had been expecting good news, felt the pressure increasing in his chest. He could not lose Sarah. He could not allow it. "What does that mean? Is she in danger?" asked Leonor, with a trembling voice. "It's difficult to say," replied the doctor. "We are managing the situation with everything we have, but there is a considerable percentage of risk. We will need constant monitoring in the coming hours. If the marrow does not begin to integrate optimally, we will have to consider alternatives, which could be even more complicated." The news was devastating, but Ronaldo could not allow himself to sink into despair. He looked around, searching for something, anything that would help him not to give up. It was then that he remembered the support he had mobilized over the last hours: friends, resources, influence. "I will do everything in my hands," he said in a firm voice, his gaze fixed on the doctor. "What do you need right now? Tell me what I must do. I will not let this end like this." The response was quick. "We need an additional support team. More specialists, more resources. Also, if we can stabilize her immune system, the chances of rejection will be significantly reduced. But it is going to be a race against time." Determined, Ronaldo took out his mobile phone. He knew what to do. With a couple of taps, he began mobilizing his network of contacts, from the best hematology specialists to the providers of the rarest medications. His mind, which was normally focused on football, was now centered exclusively on saving the life of that girl who had touched his heart. At the same time, Sarah's father murmured in a whisper full of despair, "Sarah, please, fight. You cannot leave us." The doctor returned to the operating room, leaving Ronaldo and the parents with the feeling that time was slipping through their fingers. Despite the obstacles, there was something unbreakable in Ronaldo's determination. He would not allow hope to fade away. "I will be here until the end," he murmured to himself, as the countdown between life and death continued. Suddenly, 30 minutes later, the door opened with a soft creak, and a high-level medical team, composed of specialists that Ronaldo had called in his desperation, entered the hospital with a confidence that contrasted with the anxiety of the moment. Dr. Khalid, the leader of the team, entered with a firm stride and began to coordinate quickly with the chief surgeon. "We will ensure that the graft is successful. We are going to stabilize her," he said, as the team prepared to spring into action. As the team integrated, the hospital seemed to transform into a center of high efficiency, each member with a clear and precise goal. The workflow was impeccable, and Ronaldo noticed how even amid the pressure and stress, there was something beautiful in the way everyone worked together, like a perfectly synchronized machine, driven by a single purpose: to save Sarah. Outside the operating room, Sarah's parents were calmer, but their faces still reflected the tension of uncertainty. Sarah's mother, clinging to her husband, kept her gaze fixed on the door, waiting for the slightest sign of what was happening inside. Ronaldo approached them, his face showing the fatigue of so many hours of waiting, but his words were firm and reassuring. "Everything is under control. The team has the situation in their hands." Dr. Khalid quickly reviewed Sarah's condition and indicated to his team that everything seemed to be going well. "It's a good sign," he said firmly. "Now we need to wait for the body to accept it." Ronaldo remained by the operating room door, his mind focused on the outcome. He knew that time was crucial and that in that moment he could only trust the doctors. Ronaldo looked at the parents, conveying a silent promise with his gaze. "Everything is going to be all right," he said with conviction. The air in the waiting room had thickened. With each passing second, the tick of the clock seemed heavier, more unbearable. Ronaldo was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, a mix of exhaustion and anxiety enveloping him. The operating room door opened slowly, and a murmur of hope spread through the room. But instead of the expected doctor, Dr. Khalid appeared with a slow gait, as if he were carrying an invisible weight. The doctor, with an evidently tense face, avoided eye contact. Ronaldo stepped forward, catching the doctor's gaze, and broke the silence. "How is she?" he asked, though his voice trembled as it left his mouth. Ronaldo felt it before hearing it, but his voice came out as a plea. Dr. Khalid let out a deep sigh, one that seemed to carry the entire weight of the room. And just as he opened his mouth, his hands intertwined, seeking the best way to deliver the news, a palpable pain in his gaze. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice soft, trying to find the words for what was coming. "We have tried everything we could, but there are unforeseen complications in the operation." The knot in Ronaldo's stomach tightened. He knew he did not need to hear the rest. Sarah's mother's heart pounded in her chest, as if it had been struck forcefully. Dr. Khalid swallowed and, with a sigh, finally said the word that nobody wanted to hear: "I'm sorry." But before the doctor could continue, a soft but urgent cry interrupted the scene. It was a nurse running towards them, with a pale face, but with an intensity in her voice that made everyone turn their heads. "Doctor, come back quickly," she exclaimed with the urgency of one who knows that something vital is about to happen. "You must see this. Quick. It is important." Dr. Khalid stopped dead in his tracks, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stand still. Everyone remained there, frozen, watching, waiting, not fully understanding what was happening. The nurse was breathing heavily, but her determination was so palpable that nobody dared to move a muscle. The doctor looked at her with sudden attention. "What is happening?" "It is Sarah," said the nurse, her voice lower now, but with an energy that managed to pierce through the tension of the moment. "You need to see her for yourself." The news was like a lightning bolt in the midst of a storm, illuminating the darkness, although still with shadows that did not completely dissipate. Sarah's parents looked at each other, and for the first time in hours, the lines of worry on their faces began to soften. Ronaldo, who had been holding his breath, exhaled slowly, almost with relief, but without letting his guard down. The nurse's words echoed in his mind. "Something has changed." "Let's go," said Dr. Khalid, without losing a second. Despite the fatigue reflected on his face, there was something different in his posture, something more upright, more determined. "Let's go see what happens." The doctor turned toward the operating room and advanced with a determined stride, followed by the nurse. Ronaldo, however, did not move immediately. In his mind, the entire journey, every effort, every sacrifice, was summed up in this moment. Would it be enough? And then, with one last deep breath, he moved forward after them. Uncertainty weighed in the air. The minutes stretched out as if they were hours, and the walls of the hospital seemed to close in little by little. Doctors and nurses moved quickly, coming in and out of the operating room, but none of their glances dared to meet those of Sarah's parents or Ronaldo. The atmosphere was charged with tension, with that silent energy that is only experienced in moments of crisis, when every second could mean the end or the beginning of something important. Nobody spoke much. People merely stared at the operating room door, anxious to hear Dr. Khalid's words. They feared his arrival, yet the wait was even more unbearable. "Dr. Khalid is the one who must inform you," said the few who dared to speak, as if those words could make the anguish more bearable, even though everyone knew they were not. Ronaldo had lost track of time. Every step he took felt like an additional burden, as if his legs were filled with lead. Thoughts piled up in his head, fluttering endlessly, while images of Sarah on the operating table intertwined with memories of his life in Rio de Janeiro, the flights, the meetings, the overload of work. But none of that mattered now. Only Sarah mattered. It only mattered that she was okay. And yet, he did not know if he could hold on any longer. A door was heard opening, and for a moment, Ronaldo thought that Dr. Khalid was about to enter. But it was not him. It was his mother, Maria Dolores, who had received the news of the situation through Leonor, and without anyone expecting her, she had decided to appear to accompany her son in this situation. Ronaldo's mother, with tired yet determined eyes, approached him, and without saying a word, embraced him. The embrace was like a deep breath he had been holding inside, but that he could not release until that moment. Ronaldo rested his head on his mother's shoulder, her arms surrounding him, giving him the comfort that only a mother can offer in the darkest moments. "I am so exhausted, Mom," he murmured, the words coming out of his mouth with such weight that he struggled to speak. "I have hardly slept since I left Rio. All of this has been so inhumane." His voice trembled with a vulnerability he rarely showed, especially after spending so many hours trying to maintain calm, strength, as if everything were under control. Exhaustion hit him hard, not only physical, but also emotional. Every minute of uncertainty wore him down. He only wanted to know that Sarah would be okay. His mother, upon hearing his heartbreaking confession, gently caressed his hair, a gesture that felt like a balm. "I understand you, son. I know what that girl has meant to you," she whispered, her voice tinged with unbreakable tenderness. It is normal to feel this way. You don't have to be strong all the time, you know that, right? Ronaldo nodded in silence, letting the tears he had been holding back slide down his face. He knew that football, the trips, the business, all of that mattered, but in that moment it was nothing. Only Sarah existed, and the need to see her wake up, to know that everything they had done, everything that had been risked, was worth it. Maria Dolores, without letting go of her son, looked toward the operating room door, waiting for the doctor to appear. But the anguish continued to gnaw at her stomach. "Just a little more, Ronaldo," she said, her voice full of hope, yet also marked by tension. Just a little more? Time kept passing, but now Ronaldo was not alone in his anguish. He had found comfort, even if only momentarily, in his mother's embrace, and for few instants, the feeling of exhaustion and distress was a little more bearable. All that remained was to wait. And deep down, Ronaldo knew that nothing would ever be the same after that night. The waiting room was almost completely silent, except for the dull sound of contained breaths. Each second seemed to stretch interminably between hope and fear. Ronaldo could not stop looking at the operating room door, his eyes fixed, as if with his gaze he could invoke Dr. Khaled. Sarah's parents, on the other side of the room, exchanged glances, each trying to be strong for the other, although their hearts seemed to be on the verge of exploding. Suddenly, the door opened, and everyone instinctively stood up at the same time. It was Dr. Khaled, with his usual look of concentration, but with a slight trace of fatigue visible in his eyes. Ronaldo stepped forward one step, fear and hope battling within him. "Dr. Khaled," he asked, his voice somewhat trembling. "Thank you for your patience," he began, his tone grave but serene. "Sarah has come out of the operation. It has been successful." The air in the room seemed to stop, as if the entire world had taken a breath in unison. No one spoke. The news was all they had been waiting for, but it still seemed unreal. "It has been a complex operation," the doctor continued, "but we have managed to stabilize her. The bone marrow is being accepted. We are still in a critical process, but the situation is much more hopeful than we thought at the beginning." Ronaldo closed his eyes for a moment and let out the air he did not know he had been holding. His heart continued pounding strongly, but it was one less agonizing beat. "Is there anything else we should know, doctor?" he asked, his voice lower, as if he feared that any word might ruin what he had just heard. Dr. Khaled hesitated for a moment and looked at the others, at Sarah's parents. Then he made a gesture with his hand, indicating for them to take a seat. "It has been a difficult job without a doubt," said one of the surgeons. "Yes," replied Dr. Khaled with a slight sigh. "We have been very fortunate. But even so, the road to recovery will not be without challenges. We will need to continue monitoring her progress carefully." "Thank you, doctor, truly. Thank you," said Sarah's mother, her voice choked with emotion. Her face was marked by fatigue, but her eyes shone with sincere gratitude. Ronaldo, seeing how Sarah's parents embraced each other, a little fearful but grateful, felt a surge of empathy for them. He knew what uncertainty was, the fear of losing a loved one. And although the news was positive, the danger had not completely passed. The road to recovery would be long, with unexpected challenges, but Sarah had been fortunate to be in good hands. "Doctor, what comes next now?" asked Leonore, with the serenity she always tried to convey, though it was clearly broken by tension. "We will continue monitoring her. The crucial thing is that the operation was a success, but the monitoring will take time," responded the doctor. Ronaldo could not help but smile, slightly relieved. He knew that the worst had passed. He knew that Sarah's fight had not been in vain. The young woman had an opportunity, something that minutes earlier had been completely out of her reach. "We're going to be here for anything you need," said Ronaldo, looking at Dr. Khaled with deep sincerity. "Whatever it is, just tell us. We want to help in every way we can." The doctor nodded once more, and with one last glance at the other doctors who were still conversing, he bid them farewell with a slight smile. The mission was not yet over, but at that precise moment, everyone in the room could breathe a little more easily. There was still much to go, but the road to Sarah's recovery had begun. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. Leonore approached the doctor with a gesture that attempted to be gentle, but could not hide the tension accumulated in her body. She was accustomed to being by Ronaldo's side in difficult moments, but she could not help feeling caught in that whirlwind of emotions as well. In her mind, over and over again, the image of Dr. Khaled coming out of the operating room, his face grave, while we all expected the worst, repeated itself. She could not help but wonder what had happened in those critical moments, when it seemed that everything was about to collapse. With firm yet gentle steps, she pulled the doctor a little away from the door, seeking a space where they could speak without interruption. The room continued to vibrate with palpable anxiety, but she knew that she had to ask that question, even though it was not the ideal moment. "Doctor," she began in a low voice, almost whispering, "I did not want to ask this question in front of them, because I know they are very anguished, but in due time Ronaldo will want to know what happened with Sarah at the moment when you went out to give us an evidently bad news, and then the nurse stopped you and made you re-enter the operating room." Her gaze remained fixed on the doctor's eyes, searching for an answer that could shed some light on the mystery of those minutes that seemed to have stretched into eternity. Dr. Khaled, for a moment, remained in thought. He knew that this was an inevitable question, but there was something in the way Leonore had raised it that made him think that she too carried the anguish of uncertainty. "It is true," the doctor finally said, with a tone softer than it had been all along. "When I left the operating room, I thought that Sarah's situation had become seriously complicated. There were signs that indicated that her body was not reacting as we had expected. There was a drop in her oxygen levels, and I feared that an adverse reaction might occur. That is why I prepared for the worst." He paused briefly, as if he still could not believe what had happened afterward. "But when the nurse stopped me and asked me to return to the operating room, something was already different. The situation had changed. Sarah's vital signs stabilized. It was as if her body had responded suddenly, almost as if it had been waiting for a change." Leonore listened attentively, her pulse racing, but with a sense of relief gradually replacing the initial worry. The doctor continued, as if he were reviewing the events in his mind once more. "It was a decisive moment. Sometimes in surgery, everything can change in the blink of an eye. The procedures, the body's reactions, everything is so interconnected that one cannot predict what is going to happen. And sometimes the signs are ambiguous, even contradictory." Dr. Khaled ran a hand through his forehead, as if trying to organize his thoughts before speaking. He looked at Leonore with an expression that oscillated between rationality and incredulity. "You see, Leonore," he began in a measured tone, almost as if he were choosing each word with surgical precision. "I am a man of science. I do not like to be mystical or mix religious matters into my work out of respect for the beliefs of others. But in surgery, not everything has a scientific explanation." Leonore maintained her gaze, waiting for something more, something that would justify what had happened with Sarah in that operating room. "Then," she said, seeking one last confirmation, It was an unexpected improvement, something beyond what you expected. Dr. Khaled ran a hand over his forehead, as if trying to order his thoughts before speaking. He looked at Leonore with an expression oscillating between rationality and incredulity. "Look, Leonore," he began in a measured tone, almost as if he were choosing each word with surgical precision. "I am a man of science. I do not like to be mystical or mix religious matters into my work, out of respect for others' beliefs. But in surgery, not everything has a scientific explanation. More than once," continued Khaled, "something that is present in the operating room, but that we cannot see, intervenes to change the outcomes. I cannot demonstrate it, I cannot measure it or study it, but I have seen it with my own eyes." He paused, as if hesitating to continue. "Simply, it has no explanation. We do the best we can. Every procedure, every decision is based on data, on experience, on knowledge. But if we could control everything, we could predict with certainty the outcome of every intervention. And believe me, it is not so." Leonore felt a shiver run down her spine. It was not the technical answer she had expected, but in a way, it made sense. She looked at the doctor not with skepticism, but with a strange sense of awe and respect. "Then, what do you think happened?" she asked in a low voice. Dr. Khaled looked at her for a moment, and then, with a slight smile of resignation, simply replied, "I don't know, but whatever it is, today it was on our side. Although, of course, we are still far from saying that everything is resolved. The recovery will be critical, but at this moment, we have reason to be optimistic." Leonore let out a sigh that seemed to release all the stress accumulated in her body. She knew that, despite the good news, the battle was not yet over. But there was a light, a sliver of hope in it all, and that was not insignificant. "Thank you, doctor," she said with a smile that tried to be light, although her eyes were still filled with worry. "I know that Ronaldo will need to know all this, but for now at least we can breathe a little more easily." Dr. Khaled nodded, his look conveying a mixture of fatigue and gratitude. In these cases, hope is the greatest ally. And Sarah, without a doubt, is fighting with everything she has. With that, he cast one last glance toward the waiting room before heading back to the operating room. Leonore remained silent for a moment, contemplating the closed operating room door. It was as if finally, after all that chaos, there was some clarity. Not everything was resolved, but at least the worst of the fears had been left behind. And for the first time in hours, she was able to let her shoulders relax a little. Sarah's parents were motionless, their gaze fixed on the hallway, as if they were waiting for a miracle to come out of those doors. The sound of rapid footsteps in the corridor, distant voices, and the incessant coming and going of medical personnel felt like a distant murmur, detached from the battle being waged inside the operating room. It was Leonore who broke the silence, her voice firm, but with a tone laden with the same worry that hovered in the atmosphere. "Ronaldo, people have gathered around the hospital. They are waiting for you outside, some media and onlookers. The news has spread quickly." Ronaldo closed his eyes, rubbing his face as if he could, with one motion, erase the fatigue that was crushing him. He knew that this attention, this notoriety, was something that came with his actions. But now, in this moment of vulnerability and extreme exhaustion, he did not have the energy to face it. "I know, Leonore. Under other circumstances, I wouldn't hesitate for a second to go out there, say a few words, share what we have experienced. But right now, I assure you that my body is no longer responding." Leonore nodded. She already knew that answer. She, like him, had been on her feet since the beginning of the day, helping, coordinating, being present at every decisive moment. "I know," she replied softly. "I just wanted you to be aware." However, before she could take a step back, Ronaldo looked at her with a tenderness that is found only in the most intimate moments of exhaustion. "I know that you're exhausted too. I don't want you to keep running without rest. So go to the hotel and get some sleep." "Thank you, Ronaldo," she replied. Ronaldo looked at Leonor with renewed determination. His mind never rested, it couldn't. "I want you, after you've rested, to give priority to the following," he said in a firm but tired voice. "First, make sure you locate the donor's family. If they want to meet Sarah, we will do everything possible to make that happen. This sacrifice cannot go unappreciated. And I also want to know what's happening with my pilots. Tell them to take my plane to Portugal, and we will meet there." "I will, Ronaldo. I know everything, and I will let you know soon." Ronaldo exhaled deeply, with fatigue weighing on his body, but his eyes still reflected the determination of a man who never stops fighting. Leonor was sitting next to Ronaldo. For a moment, she allowed herself to relax, savoring the brief calm she had managed to find by being with him. It had been an endless day, but Ronaldo's energy, the one that made him unbreakable, always propelled her to keep going, to not stop. And he had done so throughout so many hours, sleepless nights, decisions to be made on the fly, always with that same strength. However, something inside her, something beyond her professionalism, made her feel a deeper, more human connection with him. She rose from the chair gently, but before she could take a step, Ronaldo's voice stopped her. His tone, though tired, had taken on a serious and sincere note. "Leonor, one last thing," he said, his eyes fixed on her, almost as if he had been waiting for a moment like this to express his thoughts. "Thank you, Leonor. What you do for me is priceless. And when you speak with the pilots, tell them that they will continue to be my team, no matter what happens." "I will, Ronaldo," Leonor replied, with a timid smile that reflected the sincerity of her promise. Before Leonor turned to leave, she noticed in the distance 3 doctors hurriedly leaving the operating room where they were operating on Sarah. They seemed agitated and were discussing something among themselves. One of them, with his jaw clenched and his forehead beaded with sweat, directed his gaze at Leonor and hurried to close the door of the corridor leading to the operating rooms. Leonor, still in shock, kept her gaze fixed on the newly closed door, feeling an inexplicable discomfort. Her breathing quickened for a second, and a shiver ran down her body. Something was not right, but she could not pinpoint what. Ronaldo, noticing the change in Leonor's posture, turned his face toward her and then toward the closed door in the same direction where Leonor's eyes remained fixed. His eyes, tired but alert, sought an answer in her expression. A slight shudder ran through Leonor's body before she, trying to maintain calm, looked back at Ronaldo. "What's happening, Leonor?" asked Ronaldo, his tone serious but relaxed. Leonor, knowing that nothing could be done at that moment and fearing to add more tension to the situation, took a deep breath and, with a smile that tried to be reassuring, replied, "I thought I saw something, but I think it's just my exhaustion." Ronaldo looked at her for a moment, thoughtful, then nodded slowly. He knew that Leonor had been under enormous pressure all day, and he trusted her judgment. However, he could not help but feel a slight pang of unease settle in his chest. The operating room door opened slowly, and through the threshold, the soft murmur of the wheels of a stretcher broke the tense silence that had enveloped the waiting room. Sarah, pale but stable, was being transferred to the intensive care unit. The medical team accompanying her moved with an almost choreographed precision, with relaxed expressions, yet with a seriousness and calm that are only earned after having crossed the thin line between life and death. Sarah appeared to be deeply asleep. Her breathing was slow and regular. Her parents, visibly relieved, followed the progress of the stretcher with anxious eyes, but with a spark of renewed hope in their hearts. Dr. Khaled, the man who had led the operation, approached Sarah's parents with a firm but tired stride. His eyes, which at one point had shown unyielding tension, now reflected the exhaustion of a job well done. Still, the serenity with which he addressed Sarah's parents spoke of the certainty that they had done everything possible. "We have done the best that could be done," said the doctor in a firm and reassuring voice, as if those words were a small anchor of hope in the midst of a sea of uncertainty. "Sarah has reacted like a champion. All that remains is to wait for her progress, which will occur under the care of doctors specialized in the ICU. Relief was reflected on the faces of Sarah's parents, although the anguish still lingered, partly due to the uncertainty of the future. Ronaldo approached Dr. Khaled, his voice serious and direct. "I know what you have done for Sarah, and I want that, while Sarah recovers, a doctor of your caliber remains by her side. I will finance everything. My only priority is her recovery." With a slight nod, Dr. Khaled agreed. "That would be the highest level of care for Sarah. I already have in mind a colleague who could alternate with me to achieve that." Ronaldo nodded, a weight of relief falling upon his shoulders. He had given everything he had, and although there was still a long road to go, at least he knew he had done everything within his power. When Sarah's stretcher disappeared behind the ICU doors, the air in the room felt less dense, less crushing. But there was still a long journey ahead. Sarah had overcome a great obstacle, but Ronaldo knew that the road to her recovery was still uncertain. The real test was yet to come, and only time would tell if this miracle would withstand the complications that might still arise. Before leaving the room, Ronaldo approached the ICU door. His fingers briefly touched the handle, as if he wanted to cling to the hope that everything he had done to get there had been worth it. Ronaldo felt that his body was desperately begging for a break. As he left the waiting room, where his thoughts swirled like an unceasing storm, Ronaldo noticed the calm presence of Sarah's parents, who had been by his side the entire time. The two, a little older than him, looked just as exhausted, yet they maintained the calm that seemed to be the only way to deal with the situation. Ronaldo knew that Leonor had made arrangements for him to have a place to rest. She had booked 4 rooms in a luxurious hotel just 2 blocks from the hospital, and although his mind could not stop thinking about Sarah and the difficult wait, he knew that the body needs rest to stay strong. Sarah's parents were equally exhausted. Their eyes reflected the weight of uncertainty, yet they remained steadfast. "I know I can't alleviate everything you're feeling right now, but I want to offer you something that will at least allow you to rest. Leonor, my assistant, has booked some rooms in a very nearby hotel, just 2 blocks from here. There are 4 rooms, all available right now. I know you need a break, and I believe this might be what you need to recharge." Sarah's parents looked at each other, and for a moment there was a pause. Ronaldo's words floated in the air, filled with sincere generosity. Sarah's mother, with an expression so exhausted that it seemed fatigue had completely taken over her being, was the first to lift her gaze. "Leonor has booked rooms in a nearby hotel so that you can rest. You don't have to worry about anything. Everything is ready," Ronaldo added. Sarah's father finally lifted his gaze, and a glimmer of gratitude appeared in his eyes. His face, marked by worry, began to relax slightly. "Ronaldo, I don't know what to say." His voice trembled, not from a lack of words, but from contained emotion. This gesture, we will not forget it. Sarah's father took a deep breath and ran a hand over his face. It is very hard to accept, but we needed it. We both needed it. Thank you, Ronaldo. Sarah's parents looked at each other and agreed that one of them should remain at the hospital. Mr. Juvencio insisted. Go, my love, rest. I will rest when you return. Sarah's mother got up, said goodbye to her husband, and left for the hotel with Leonor. Ronaldo watched them leave and exhaled deeply. Perhaps, for the first time in many hours, he could close his eyes and regain his strength. An abrupt noise shattered the stillness of the corridor. Ronaldo, who until that moment had been in a state of tense drowsiness, suddenly lifted his head. The ICU doors swung open wide, and in a matter of seconds, 3 doctors entered with quick, firm steps, followed by a couple of nurses hurriedly pushing a stretcher. The cold, white light of the corridor reflected the sweat on their foreheads as they moved medical equipment with surgical precision. Juvencio also straightened up, alert. The sudden activity broke the anguished calm in which they had been immersed. Soon, the team left again, this time pushing an occupied bed. They were taking it back to the operating room. Ronaldo's heart raced. He stood up and moved toward them with a knot in his chest, desperately searching for a glimpse of Sarah among the moving bodies. Sarah, his voice barely emerged haltingly. But as he took another step closer, he could clearly see that it was not her. It was another patient, an elderly man, with an IV connected to his arm and a mask covering his face. Ronaldo exhaled, but his relief lasted only for an instant. He turned his head toward the ICU, and a new worry took hold of him. Dr. Khaled's relief had not yet arrived. Minutes passed and unease settled in his chest. He couldn't help but think that at this moment inside that room, Sarah was not guaranteed the highest level of care. The hospital continued operating. The doctors were attending to multiple emergencies, but what if something happened? What if right now she needed them more than ever, and the care wasn't the same without Dr. Khaled present? He ran a hand over his face, trying to clear the anguish. He couldn't do anything, only wait. And waiting at this moment was his worst punishment. The night advanced, and the hospital's bustle had given way to a tense calm. Ronaldo still felt that he couldn't stop. He knew that outside the hospital the cameras, the questions, and the expectant stares of those who had followed Sarah's story since the moment the plane touched down were waiting for him. But what he needed most right now was to be alone, even if only for a few minutes. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the empty corridor as he walked toward a back door. He knew that any misstep would lead him straight into the center of the media storm, and he wasn't prepared for that. He felt exhausted, drained, as if every cell in his body were begging him for a break. When he reached the door, Ronaldo pushed it open gently, making sure no one saw him. The cool night air greeted him with a sigh, almost as if the world were larger than he had imagined during those endless hours. He stopped for a moment, breathing deeply, and allowed the silence to envelop him. It was strange, in the midst of the illuminated, lively city, to feel that emptiness around him. But at the same time, he was grateful not to be watched. He needed that space to clear his mind. The rain had left the sidewalk slippery, and the cool wind caressed his face. His body demanded rest, but his mind kept turning. Sarah's admission to the ICU, the labored breathing, the worry in his parents' eyes. Yet something inside him felt calmer. He had done what he could. The rest was no longer up to him. As he walked through the lonely streets, his phone vibrated in his pocket. It wasn't a surprise. He knew that Leonor had already begun to coordinate everything, but he needed someone else to take charge. He needed to be an observer, if only for a moment, without the pressure of constant decisions, without the stares of others. He was exhausted. When he arrived at the hotel, the calm of the lobby hit him like relief. He took the keys and silently rode the elevator, wrapped in his exhaustion. When the elevator doors opened, he entered his room with slow steps, almost as if every movement required monumental effort. The room was silent, as if the whole world had been left behind. But no matter how much he tried to relax, his mind returned to Sarah's eyes, to his parents' fatigue, to the weight of what was still missing. That night, he knew he couldn't go on any longer. He needed to rest. He closed the door behind him and collapsed onto the bed. The world would still be there when he woke up, but now, at last, he had a truce. At least until dawn. Just as his eyes began to close, his phone vibrated. A notification. Something that suddenly pulled him back into the world he was trying to escape. The sun had barely begun to peek over the horizon when Ronaldo woke up, with the feeling that time had stopped, yet at the same time, it was rushing around him like a storm. However, as he opened his eyes and picked up his phone, something in his chest lightened. It was Leonor, always on top of everything, always ready to convey the news he so desperately needed to hear. Sarah remained stable, he thought as his eyes scanned the lines of the message. A sigh of relief escaped his lips. The specialist that Dr. Khaled ordered was already present in the ICU, and a relative calm settled within him upon knowing that Sarah was under the care of experts. The uncertainty that had marked the entire early morning began to fade. The message continued. She will be rotated at 2 p.m. with Drive Khaled. But the phone wouldn't stop vibrating. As he continued reading, the words about the pilots arrived. Despite some difficulties, they could still remain part of his team. They will tell you the details when they meet with you upon your return to Portugal. The message continued. The donor was an 18-year-old boy. I have already found out who his parents are. The news touched him in a different way. The young man had suffered an accident months ago, and after a long period in a vegetative state, his parents had made the difficult decision to disconnect him. Although his life could no longer go on, the parents chose for his legacy to endure by donating his organs to give someone else another chance. Now, Sarah had that chance. Thanks to them, your plane should be departing for Portugal today. Everything seemed to be following its course, a course he had never imagined but had embraced with courage. Finally, Leonor's words offered him something he had not expected. Your mother and I are in the room next to yours. A gesture of affection, of presence, of unconditional support that he could not ignore. The mere fact of knowing that his mother was nearby made him feel a little more human, a little more anchored to reality amid all the chaos. Setting the phone aside, Ronaldo slowly got up. His body was exhausted, but his mind was active. Today is another day, he thought, and if everything we have done is worth it, then it doesn't matter what it costs. As he got dressed, he felt a renewed determination. He was ready for whatever came next. Ronaldo felt strange as he entered the hotel restaurant. He sat at a table by the window, the bustle of the restaurant completely detached from the internal storm he carried within. His mind could not stray from Sarah and the uncertainty about her health. He barely tasted the coffee before him. He ordered something light, without any desire to eat. Fresh fruits, whole-grain bread, he thought almost by instinct. He was absent, focused on his worry for Sarah. Despite the circumstances, Ronaldo was not willing to hide. He knew that in some way he had to acknowledge those who supported him, those who followed him, even those who, without knowing the whole story, felt part of his mission. So, with a slight sigh, he decided to get up. He opened the hotel door and found himself facing a group of reporters, cameras, and fans waiting outside. "Ronaldo, Ronaldo," they shouted, but he did not want to elaborate. He raised his hand and in a firm voice gave a brief report about Sarah, thanking them for their support. Then, without another word, he returned to the hotel. He had more decisions to make, more steps to take. The hotel restaurant was his refuge for now, but the mission ahead of him was not over yet. Today will be a good day, a day when everything will be all right, he thought, although he knew there was still much to be done. The morning light filtered through the window. Ronaldo knew that he could wait no longer. Sarah needed him. He decided to leave without waking anyone up. He did not want any company. With a slight tilt of his head toward the table, where he had left his phone, Ronaldo stood up, feeling the weight of the decision with every step he took toward the door. He did not want anyone to see him at that moment. He did not want anyone to stop him. But just as he crossed the threshold, he heard his name. "Ronaldo." The voice came from somewhere nearby, a slightly distorted shout, as if someone were still chewing something. He turned, surprised, and saw Leonor approaching him with unusual speed. "Let me accompany you," said Leonor, almost without taking a breath, as she walked toward him. "I've already rested enough. Your mother stayed behind, getting ready and eating. In a few minutes, she'll join us at the hospital." "You don't have to, Leonor," he replied, in a soft yet firm voice. Leonor looked at him intently. "I know you, Ronaldo, and I know you need to be there, but not alone." "All right," he said, his words accompanied by a grateful smile. "Let's go." Then, as they made their way toward the exit, the muffled sounds of the city began to seep through the hotel walls. Outside, life continued its course, indifferent to the anguish he felt. Ronaldo kept his gaze forward, but his mind remained trapped in the same question that had tormented him all night. Finally, without turning around, he let out an almost imperceptible whisper. "I barely slept. I couldn't stop thinking." He paused as if hesitating to continue. "Did I do everything possible, Leonor? Could I have done better?" She stopped for a second and looked at him attentively. She knew that Ronaldo was not someone who easily expressed his doubts, much less allowed himself to be vulnerable. Without thinking too much, she placed a hand on his forearm, forcing him to look at her. "Absolutely," she replied with unbreakable certainty. "And if I were ever truly ill, I would love for you to be the one in charge, as you have been with Sarah." A dense yet warm silence fell between them. Ronaldo kept his gaze ahead. Cairo was awakening with its usual chaos. He took a deep breath, processing Leonor's words. Finally, he nodded with a slight tilt of his head, without needing to say anything more. And with that certainty, they headed toward the hospital. Upon arriving at the hospital, they had taken no more than 2 steps into the entrance when a figure appeared in front of them. "Mr. Ronaldo." The doctor's voice stopped them abruptly. His expression was tense, his posture rigid, as if he were holding back something too great to be said all at once. Ronaldo felt as if blood were hammering in his ears. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice firm, though his stomach already braced for the worst. The doctor took a breath, as if measuring every word before releasing it. "We need to talk," he said, his gaze grave. "Something has changed." The world seemed to close in around Ronaldo. His pulse skyrocketed. Leonor tensed beside him, but he did not look at her. He couldn't. He could only think of Sarah. "What does that mean?" he demanded, his voice now rougher. The doctor hesitated for a fraction of a second. "It's better that we discuss it in private." Ronaldo exchanged a quick glance with Leonor, who nodded imperceptibly. Suddenly, the air felt denser, as if all the oxygen had been replaced by an unbearable uncertainty. Without saying another word, he followed the doctor down the corridor, and with each step, his heart pounded with a single question. Was Sarah all right, or had something gone wrong? The corridor seemed longer than usual. Every step echoed in Ronaldo's head like an endless reverberation. Beside him, Leonor kept her gaze fixed on the doctor, as if trying to decipher something in his expression before he spoke. When they finally reached a small meeting room inside the hospital, the doctor calmly closed the door and turned toward them. "First of all, I want you to know that Sarah is stable," he said, raising a hand as if attempting to calm any catastrophic thoughts. Ronaldo exhaled, feeling an invisible pressure ease just a little in his chest. "Then what happened?" he asked, frowning. The doctor took a brief moment before answering. "The procedure was successful, but we have noticed some reactions in her system that we want to monitor closely. It is not unusual after a bone marrow transplant, but it requires constant observation." Ronaldo nodded, trying to process the information. "What kind of reactions are we talking about?" Leonor interjected, ever pragmatic. "A slight fever, fatigue more pronounced than expected, nothing alarming for now. But we must ensure that it is not the onset of a rejection. That is why we wanted to speak with you before you see her, so that you know she might be weaker than you imagine." Ronaldo nodded slowly. It was not the best news, but it was not the worst either. The important thing was that Sarah was still fighting. "Can we see her?" he asked firmly. The doctor gave a barely noticeable smile. "Of course. But do not exhaust her too much. She has been asking for you, Ronaldo." Something tightened in his chest. Without waiting any longer, he followed the doctor toward the ICU, with Leonor right behind him. A nurse greeted them at the entrance of the ICU with a slight smile on her face, and informed them that Sarah had awakened and that her parents were accompanying her at that very moment. Ronaldo let out a deep sigh, almost unconsciously, and a smile appeared on his face. From the ICU window, Ronaldo saw the comings and goings of the doctors. Then, he turned toward Leonor with a spark in his eyes. "I need you to get 15 balls." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the specialist designated by Dr. Khaled emerged from the ICU to meet Ronaldo. "Ronaldo, before you go in, there is something we do not know how to handle. Her condition is not as stable as we thought." The air grew heavy for Ronaldo, and the smile that had begun to form on his face quickly faded. A knot surged in his stomach like an unstoppable wave. "What are you saying? Is she in danger?" The doctor hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. "We are doing everything possible, but we still cannot say that she is out of danger." A heavy silence fell. Ronaldo stood there, in that intermediate space between the entrance and uncertainty, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The minutes seemed to stretch on. He wanted to go in, to embrace her, to assure her that everything was going to be all right, but something inside him would not let him move. Leonor saw the tense expression on his face and stepped toward him, gently touching his arm. "Ronaldo, go see her. You can't stay here." Ronaldo nodded, but not without casting a glance at the doctor, who seemed to feel the same anxiety as he did. In the end, there was nothing left to do but to go in. Ronaldo took a deep breath and crossed the threshold of the door, advancing slowly, his mind still trapped in the confusion of the doctor's words. As soon as he saw her there in the bed awakening, he knew that there was still much to be done, but at least she was there. Ronaldo approached Sarah's bed slowly, his steps measured, almost as if each one connected him more deeply with the young woman who had fought so hard for her life. Her eyes were a little brighter, her breathing more calm, and although she was still connected to several tubes and monitors, her face reflected the calm that only comes after a storm. Sarah's father had left a few minutes ago, leaving them alone so that she could rest and speak with him. Ronaldo approached Sarah's bed with a warm smile. "Hello, champion. How are you feeling?" Ronaldo sat in the chair next to her bed, leaning in slightly toward her. "You are amazing, you know. We all thought that this moment would never come, but here you are, fighting like a champion. I am very proud of you." Sarah smiled, and although her voice was low, her determination was reflected in her eyes. "Thank you? I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Ronaldo replied with a warm smile, looking around at where some of the other patients occupying nearby beds were beginning to notice his presence. The gazes of the patients rested on him, filled with surprise and admiration. "Ronaldo, they're looking at you," said Leonore as she entered the room with a smile on her lips. She was carrying a couple of bags, but when she entered, everyone's eyes turned toward her, and then toward the bag she carried. Ronaldo quickly stood up, his face illuminated by an idea he had had during the wait. He approached Leonore and, looking at everyone present, asked the head nurse if he could bring in the balls. After a few seconds, the head nurse nodded, permitting the gesture. Football had already begun to heal more than bodies in that room. "Can you raise your hand, Sarah?" said Ronaldo. She raised her hand with effort, but with a determination that made Ronaldo smile. "Yes," she replied. "Perfect," said Ronaldo. "Now you will be in charge of giving away these balls." Sarah looked at the balls. Then her eyes met Ronaldo's, who, with a kind gesture, indicated the first one to her. "Who do you want to give this to?" Sarah began pointing at patients, and Ronaldo handed each ball with a smile and words of encouragement, filling the room with emotion and hope. The room filled with murmurs and smiles as the atmosphere changed, becoming lighter, more cheerful. To each patient Ronaldo approached, with the ball in hand. The gesture was repeated. He signed the ball, left it next to the bed, and said words of encouragement. Sarah observed everything with a smile she couldn't hide. The patients, some barely awake, others with eyes shining with emotion, thanked Ronaldo and her. The doctors also looked on in amazement, some with glassy eyes, surprised by the unexpected kindness that had overflowed in the room. Leonore smiled from the door, watching how the room transformed into a space of hope. When Ronaldo finished, he approached Sarah again, his eyes shining, and said in a low voice, "Look at what you've done, Sarah. You are helping everyone just with a gesture, and that is what makes you amazing." Sarah smiled at him with a warmth that, despite her state of health, managed to convey an unsuspected strength. "Thank you, Ronaldo. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this." The atmosphere became a song to life, a celebration of what could still be, despite the difficulties. And for a few moments, everyone in the room shared that feeling of pure joy, as if the whole world had fit into that precise moment. Leonore watched Ronaldo as he checked the last balls he had left by the beds. The atmosphere of the ICU, which moments before had been charged with tension, now seemed to be enveloped in a peace that everyone shared. However, Leonore knew that there was still something important to do, something that Ronaldo had not yet considered, but that did not escape her notice. With a knowing smile, Leonore lifted an additional bag that she had been discreetly keeping. She brought it to Ronaldo, who looked at it curiously as she unzipped it. "I know you don't want to leave out the doctors and nurses here in the ICU," said Leonore, her eyes shining with sympathy and understanding. That's why I brought these." Inside the bag, Ronaldo saw a dozen stethoscopes specially designed to be personalized. On the top of the diaphragm, a smooth surface of 5 centimeters allowed for engraving of signatures or messages, turning them into unique keepsakes. These are perfect," said Ronaldo, with a smile that lit up his face. "They're unique." The stethoscopes were not only a gift, but a special piece that would combine function with memory, and that made them even more valuable. Leonore nodded, satisfied. She knew that although these stethoscopes were not professional tools, their value resided in the gesture. A simple object, but one that would carry a signature that for many doctors and nurses would become a treasure. Ronaldo took the bag carefully, and with the excitement of a child with a new toy, approached the medical staff standing near the ICU door. "Good morning, how are you all? I have something for you," said Ronaldo, his voice warm and generous. The doctors, surprised, exchanged looks of disbelief. Some smiled, others seemed to hold back tears. No one expected something like that. "These are for you," said Ronaldo as he began handing out the stethoscopes one by one. "I know how hard it is to be here, taking care of the patients day after day, and I want you to remember that what you do is invaluable. So, it is my pleasure to offer you this small gift." Every nurse and every doctor received their stethoscope with a smile, and all, without exception, asked Ronaldo to sign it on that curious area opposite the diaphragm. The patients still in their beds, some too weak to get up, watched the scene. The atmosphere, which had been serious and solemn, was now filled with murmurs of gratitude and joy. Ronaldo smiled as he signed, taking each stethoscope with the same dedication he had shown with the footballs. The black ink of his signature contrasted with the shiny metal of the stethoscopes, transforming those common objects into indelible memories of a special moment. "For you, doctor, with all my gratitude," said Ronaldo to the first doctor who received his gift. Then, to a nurse who had been at the entrance, he handed another one, signing quickly, ensuring that each one received the same attention. "Thanks to you, the world keeps turning. And all of us here, patients and staff alike, are witnesses to your effort. I don't want you to forget that." The doctors looked at him, some with tears in their eyes, others with smiles of astonishment. No one expected something like that in such a solemn place, but that was the gift Ronaldo gave them. The recognition of their humanity, the reminder that their work not only mattered but inspired. With one last look full of gratitude, Ronaldo headed toward the exit of the ICU, where Leonore was waiting for him with a look of pride. He said nothing, but the gesture said it all. The joy continued to float in the air, leaving a feeling of peace and hope that would remain long after Ronaldo had left. The sun of Rio de Janeiro bathed the grass of the newly inaugurated stadium in the neighborhood where Sarah had grown up. It was one of those Sundays that seemed made for smiling. The community had poured into the event, filling the stands with banners, T-shirts, and the vibrant energy that only football could awaken. It was a charity event, but for Ronaldo, it meant something more. In the VIP box, among politicians and celebrities, there were seats reserved for a special group. The referee whistled, and the game began. Ronaldo moved with his usual ease, yet with the serenity of someone who no longer needs to prove anything. Every pass, every dribble, every smile exchanged with his teammates were small reminders that football, in the end, is a universal language. Midway through the match, an ovation arose in the stands. A woman in a white robe descended the stairs of the box. She did not run. She walked with the certainty of someone who knew her purpose. It was Sarah, Ronaldo saw her approach the edge of the field and, for an instant, everything else disappeared. She was no longer the pale and fragile girl he had once known in Egypt. Her eyes were no longer dimmed by illness, but full of life. The ovation subsided when she took the microphone. Many years ago, when I was in a hospital bed, this man promised me that he would play a match to celebrate my recovery. She paused, letting the emotion seep into her voice. I didn't know if I would ever get to see him. But here I am. Sarah unbuttoned her robe and revealed the Brazilian national team jersey with Ronaldo's number on the back. The crowd roared. Ronaldo laughed, moved, and with a gesture asked her to come closer. Taking a microphone, while Sarah approached, Ronaldo asked that select group accompanying her in the box to come down as well and join them for a moment. Embracing Sarah and then holding her hand aloft, he said, 6 years ago, in a hospital on the other side of the world, I promised that I would play a match to celebrate the life of a girl who fought like a champion. He paused, letting the excited murmur of the crowd settle. That girl is here today, but she is no longer a girl. Now she is a future doctor, with a story that inspires more than any goal ever could. The ovation thundered in the stands. Sarah covered her mouth with her hands, moved. Ronaldo handed the match ball to Sarah, saying, "You have won, doctor." She smiled and, on impulse, took a pen from the pocket of her gown. With a ceremonial gesture, she signed the ball and raised it into the air, provoking a new wave of applause. A few seconds later, the group coming down from the box joined them. They were some doctors and nurses who had cared for her in Egypt, representing those who could not attend. They carried the stethoscopes that Ronaldo had given them hanging from their chests. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss more inspiring content. Share this video with friends and family who need to see stories that challenge perspectives and leave an indelible mark. Explore our channel to discover stories that inspire and transform. Until the next video. The photograph of that moment, of Ronaldo, Sarah, doctors, and nurses on a football field in Rio de Janeiro, would remain in the memory of many. Some time later, in the Asylum Hospital in Egypt, a child was looking at a display case in the corridor. Inside, next to an autograph ball, there was a photograph of Ronaldo and Sarah with doctors and nurses on a football field, smiling and embracing. A young doctor leaned in beside him. "Do you want to know what that photo means?" he asked. The child nodded. "It is the story of someone who used his fame to save a life, and of someone who, with his own life, decided to save many more."